instead of thinking about the other life, our salvation, our soul, we became more and more preoccupied and busy with issues of this world and worldly issues and worldly matters. Any economic change is always preceded by some religious or cultural change. Max Weber called this the spirit of capitalism. The whole modern project of capitalism and modernity is really just someone trying to avenge ينتقم من الإسلام والمسيحية by telling humans that you are like an animal and your reality is one of war and survival and striving to survive. Again, an idea that was also developed by Thomas Hobbes, who talked about the state of nature. When you convince humans that this is what they are, you have already opened up the possibilities for an economic system that looks like capitalism. It tells us that every time a prophet was sent to a community, the first group that will fight the prophet were the ruling class, the elite class, the rich class, not using false advertising, not overpricing, not taking advantage of your buyers. And at the same time, on the buyer's side, that buyers have to feel with the seller, that sometimes not all sellers are predatory, that some sellers sometimes they're in a tight spot and buyers have to feel with them. So this reciprocal relationship between a buyer and seller, عن تراض منكم, by the Prophet, التجارة تسعة أعشار الرزق. Now this can be explained in both ways. And if who you are trading with is God, then that should put on you a grave responsibility. When God uses trade to explain one of the most intimate relationship between a believer and his creator, then God is using a model that he must definitely feel very highly of. Vicegerency, responsibility, piety, justice, virtue. And anytime you break any part of this formula, the whole formula breaks apart.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. نرحب بكم في سلسلة حوارات فكرية ومعرفية، وفي هذه الحلقة نستضيف الدكتور أيمن رضا من لبنان. أهلا وسهلا بكم. The discussion about spiritual dimensions, transcendent values, virtues, ethics, and morality is always fascinating because it reflects the inner need of sacred meaning. It reflects our existential poorness, our yearning to the real life and afterlife, our thirst to God and eternity, and our deep innate call to return back to God and strengthen the relation with our Creator. By living a beautiful life full of values, divine virtues, and remembering all the graces of God around us, to live in peace, light, justice, and awaken our souls to discover the different manifestations of God in the world and inside ourselves. As the verse of the Quran says, we will show them our signs in the horizons and within themselves until it becomes clear to them that it is the truth. But it is not sufficient concerning your Lord that He is over all things a witness. أولم يكفي بربك أنه على كل شيء شهيد. Dr. Ayman Rida is a doctor. He has a PhD in Islamic economics. He taught in Lebanese American University. He taught in the University of Michigan in Dearborn in the United States. And he's currently a researcher in the history of Islamic economics. And he is the author of the book Prophecy, Piety, and Prophets. In this talk, we will be with Dr. Ayman. We will start with this point. You mentioned in your articles that there is an economy which is different than the current capitalist economy and other schools of thought in economics. And this economic society is based on virtues, morals, ethics, which are derived from the divine essence and revelation.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والحمد لله رب العالمين. Thank you, Sayyid Hadi, for inviting me to this discussion. This is a wonderful opportunity, and I hope we can contribute to the knowledge of the audience about Islamic economics and how it compares and contrasts with other economic systems. In response to your question, let me start by just commenting a bit about the ayah. We will show them our signs in the horizons. One of the most popular philosophers who is still living with us today, Alasdair MacIntyre, at Notre Dame, started his classic work on philosophy by asking that we imagine a planet struck by a catastrophic disaster. And as a result, all the inhabitants, all the people living in this planet have lost most of their technology and scientific knowledge. So all the record they had of all the science, all the knowledge, all the technology they have developed over centuries was wiped out completely overnight. So in a sense, they live in a sort of dark age. And then MacIntyre uses this metaphor or allegory to say, well, this is what is happening to us in the modern world, but instead of science and technology, let's think in terms of ethics and morality. So we have lost our record of tradition of ethics, religion, and morality. And as a result, we now lack the moral vocabulary to comprehend ethical matters and offer solutions. I don't think we are there yet as a society or as a civilization. I believe that God will continue to reveal to us his signs. And I believe that there will remain among us people who can see these signs and know the truth. But it is getting increasingly difficult to see these signs and know the truth in the modern world that we live in. Now, in response to your first question, which is this economy that Islamic economics or Islamic economic thought is presenting to us, which we will discuss as we progress through the interview or the meeting, is this economy, the economy that's based on virtue, how is it different from the other economic systems we have? If it's different, is it better? Is it worse? And more importantly, is it an economic system that's feasible? Is it practical? Can it be implemented? Or is this just an exercise in empty utopian thinking that will get us nowhere, basically? And to answer this question, I have to start with some personal background, very brief, but personal background. When I was in my teenage years, the first introduction to the field of Islamic economics was when I read the book اقتصادنا by Sayyid Muhammad باقر الصدر, which I believe is an intellectual masterpiece and is still unappreciated and remains unsurpassed in the field. I don't believe any work on Islamic economics even comes close to what Shahid Sadr did with اقتصادنا. Sadr makes a very important distinction. He makes a distinction in Islamic economics between doctrine and science, النظرية والعلم. Doctrine represents the theoretical aspect of this Islamic economic system that he was trying to present to us, to develop for us. Its worldview, its outlook, its principles. This is what in economics we call the normative side, the prescriptive side, the side that tells us what the main principles are. And science is the aspect of Islamic economics that deals with observation, explanation, analysis. So this is the descriptive side. So normally you would have doctrine first, and then it is followed by science. You cannot have an Islamic science of economics if you do not have a doctrine of Islamic economics. So the science comes after. Now, when we speak of Islamic economics, or an Islamic economic system, or an Islamic market, which is a virtuous market, we are still in the area we call doctrine. And this is important because we have to be honest and transparent and say that what we are really discussing is, for the most part, hypothetical. It is conjectural thinking. At best, we have glimpses of what this economy would look like. And if we go back to the golden years of the Islamic civilization, you can identify examples of where this Islamic economics system, of what it has to offer. But we have yet to have a fully developed Islamic economic system, the type that Shahid Sadr imagined or envisioned. Now, the doctrine is easy to develop, is easy to establish, but the science, as Muslims, we still do not have an Islamic science because we still do not have an Islamic economic system. But to move from the theory or the doctrine to the science, it takes a leap of faith. And this is what we are missing as Muslims. We are scared of taking that leap of faith. And it's not only with Muslims. This is not unique to Islam. Even in Christianity, many Christian economists argue that the number one problem that Christian societies face is that they have yet to take this leap of faith into practicing what Christianity dictates in terms of economics. Now, one last point on this question, and which I feel is important for the remainder of our discussion, is Shahid al-Sadr, when he discusses the difference between doctrine and science, he tries to answer those who argue that this is just a utopia, this is just someone coming up with dreams that will never come true. Shahid al-Sadr says the problem we face is that as a society, as people, as intellectuals, we suffer from what he called khida' al-waqi' al-tatbiqi, delusion of the applied existing reality. The fact that we feel that capitalism, for example, which is the predominant economic system in the world, it is so dominant that we feel it can never be changed. This is what will remain with us. What is and will remain forever. That capitalism
the illusion
is
that we live nowadays.
Yes. That capitalism is natural, it's necessary, it's inevitable. Take an example of usury, for example. So the idea of usury is today, it's impossible for people to think of a world without interest, without usury.
We can't replace it by any alternative system because we need a whole system to be changed.
Right, right. So we surrender to the reality that we live in. The reason we surrender is, and I will make this point more clearer as we progress, is that we ourselves have chosen to limit our perimeter of thought. And we have placed limits on how we think. And the limits we place is a result of ignoring religion, of excluding religion from our discussion, from our language. And because what is unique about religion is أنه منزل. It's external. It's outside of this world. And until we adopt something that's outside of this world, we can never expect something from within the world to change it. It has to be something from without. And when you exclude revelation, when you exclude the wahi, wal-rusul, you have excluded the possibility of someone saving you from the reality that you live in.
And this is a very deep philosophical discussion because what you were saying is a result of the modernity and the globalization and the philosophical system that are penetrating everywhere nowadays.
Yes, yes.
So you mentioned a point that in theory, in conceptions, there is something that has been written, like Shaykh الصدر did in اقتصادنا or other books, but there is a gap that we can't go to the second step and talk about the application or implementation of such theory.
Yes, until the doctrine is implemented, then we can see what this Islamic economics looks like in practice. Personally, as someone who believes in this system, I may be willing to take that leap of faith, but not everyone is willing to take that leap of faith, because it's not tried, it's not experienced yet. But what if by taking this leap of faith, we realize that on the other side there is ما لا عين رأت ولا أذن سمعت, something that amazes us. But we feel it's too much work to go there.
And this is what Quran mentions. ولو أن أهل القرى آمنوا واتقوا لفتحنا عليهم بركات من السماء.
Exactly.
Doctor, sorry, what do you mean by the leap of faith?
Leap of faith is a term that was used by a philosopher from Denmark. His name is Søren Kierkegaard, who used to say that in life, believers have to it's similar to Imam Ali إذا هبت من شيء فقع فيه. يعني leap of faith is someone who believes, but maybe his belief is shaky. ليطمئن قلبي. Take that leap of faith and وسيطمئن قلبك, but it has to start with you. You have to plunge yourself into the experience and believing that at the other side, it's like someone jumping over a cliff, but believes that God will be there to make sure he doesn't fall and break himself. But we're scared of taking that leap of faith, and we want to live in the security and safety of the reality we are in.
Great. And before we go in the details of such an alternative economic system, even though in our theories now, I'll ask another question, because now we have some philosophers and thinkers such as Abdul Wahab al-Masiri or Zygmunt Bauman. They believe that the sublime transcendent value of humanity was replaced with formalities and the body, such that the humanity was transformed into a being that is stripped before its base desires, leading to the destruction of its secret, magic, and transcendent dimensions. And this is a great challenge which faces humanity in the era of modernity that we live in, and in the globalization which is taking over every place.
Okay. Let me go back to Shaykh al-Sadr. It's amazing that when you read Shaykh al-Sadr, you realize how much he said, but very few people read him these days, unfortunately. Shaykh al-Sadr tries to explain why capitalism developed. Now, when we talk about theories of where capitalism and modernity came from, in response to your question, what comes to mind are people like Max Weber, for example, or Karl Marx, or Adam Smith. Shaykh al-Sadr had his own opinion on the subject. He said, in Europe specifically, and then later on this extended to the West in general, in Europe what happened is, before you had an economic transformation, which over time we now call capitalism or modern capitalism, what came before was a religious transformation or a cultural transformation. This transformation was that the European person, the ordinary European person, gradually stopped looking to the heavens and started looking to the earth. Yani instead of looking up, we were looking down. Instead of thinking about the other life, our salvation, our soul, we became more and more preoccupied and busy with issues of this world and worldly issues and worldly matters. And this is a very important point, that any economic change is always preceded by some religious or cultural change. Max Weber called this the spirit of capitalism. So this is the transformation that was taking place. And another modern philosopher, his name is Professor John Milbank, also argues that modernism and capitalism at its roots, if you go to the origin of where capitalism came from, its roots are neo-pagan. يعني نحن in Arabic من الجاهلية. So الجاهلية in Christianity is pagan thought, or the period pre-Christianity, before Christianity was pagan. Now, after Christianity and the beginning of the Renaissance and the Enlightenment, many philosophers, especially Machiavelli and Thomas Hobbes, tried to give life back to some of the pagan ideas from the Greeks and the Romans and before. Now, the way they tried to give life to these pagan ideas is to come up with some mixture of paganism and some elements of religion, Christianity, for example, because they lived within a Christian society. And for you to change this Christian society to something that resembles paganism, it has to be a gradual, very subtle and implicit change. It cannot be sudden or immediate, because then your agenda, your project will fail. So people like Hobbes and Machiavelli, they slowly try to merge some of these pagan ideas with some elements of Christianity. And so Milbank argues that what really was happening was not theology against secularism. It's not a deen against al-ladin or al-ilhad or al-ilmaniya. It was religion against anti-religion. Yani it was a theology against another theology. One economist used to say, only a theory can kill a theory. So if you have a religion and you're trying to get rid of that religion, you have to come with an alternative religion. And this is what the Renaissance and Enlightenment is all about. It was about coming up with a new theology, but it's a theology that has nothing to do with Christianity. It's a theology that has nothing to do with Islam.
الجاهلية المعاصرة, just like some scholars.
Yes. So he calls it neo-pagan. But it's a theology that at the end of the day, when you follow that theology, it will take you to a place where there is no longer religion anymore. And Max Weber argued this. He said that for the Reformation to happen, for capitalism to happen, you needed to come up with ideas like predestination and so on that justifies this capitalist spirit to make profit, constant profit. You had to justify it religiously. In other words, you had to bring something from religion to tell people that this change that is happening to you, this is part of God's divine plan. This is not someone who is trying to attack your religion. No, this is what religion should be about. And this is where things become really tricky, because religious scholars, once they realized that the changes that were happening were religious changes at the root, it's not just simply a secular model trying to replace a religious model. It's a new religious model replacing an older religious model. But this new religious model will lead us to secularism. It will lead us at the end of the day to modern capitalism and modernity.
دائما لكي تخدع الناس لابد أن تمزج شيئا من الحق وشيئا من الباطل كي تقنعهم بخداعك هذا، يعني كما يقال. حتى ذكرتني أنه حتى سابقا في التاريخ الإسلامي أنه بعض الظلماء حينما أرادوا أن يسيطروا يعني يلعبون في البنية الفكرية للناس، فيقولون لهم أنتم مجبورون ولا تستطيعون أن تغيروا أي شيء، ولذلك هم يقتنعون أن الوضع هو على أفضل ما يكون. يعني.
That's predestination. Yes, that's predestination. لأنه when you convince people that God created the world in such a way that what is what should be, and there is nothing you can do about it. This way you justify whoever has power should still have that power, and whoever is poor and oppressed should only accept this as their fate, as their destiny. But it tells us something else. It tells us that this means that capitalism acknowledges that human beings are spiritual beings. Yani capitalism, this is the double truth. Yani on one side, you're trying to market the idea that we are animals and there is no such thing as a soul or a spirit. But at the same time, you know that we are not animals, and there is a side to us that is spiritual and always yearns for the absolute, the transcendental, for the divine. Because if you did not believe that humans were spiritual beings, you would not try to justify your new system on religious grounds. You would have used completely different grounds. But the fact that you always use religion to justify acts and ideas that are anti-religious is you implicitly acknowledging that at our core, within us, there is a dimension to us that is spiritual. But again, this is a project that will continue. يعني في القرآن أفحكم الجاهلية يبغون. And this, I will talk about this later. This idea that the modern project, and this is what John Milbank is arguing, that the whole modern project of capitalism and modernity is really just someone trying to avenge, ينتقم من الإسلام والمسيحية, to revenge from Islam and Christianity, to revenge that they lost to these religions and they want to bring back what was before them.
Even there is a theory that says, like, for example, the flag, the national anthem, the modern government systems, all these symbols are another replacement for the need for religion and spirituality in the life of people.
Yes, yes. There are new books today that come out that talk that economics itself has become the new religion. The field of economics is the new religion, and economists are the high priests of this new religion. It's an idea that started with Karl Marx, actually. But if you think about it, economics has become a theology. The way we explain the world is not through the Quran or the Bible. The way we explain the world is through
numbers, graphs, materialism.
Yes, the ideas of neoclassical economics, Keynesian economics, Austrian economics, and so on and so forth.
Great. So here, my last question in this great and long introduction. A human being have been replaced to a mechanical machine. تحول الإنسان إلى آلة. And this is based on this materialistic cosmic view which equals the human being to nature and other creatures such as plants and animals. تتم تسوية حقيقة الإنسان بالطبيعة وبالمخلوقات الأخرى. Thus, any spiritual, ethical, virtuous, or metaphysical dimension is being neglected the more modernity and technology and modern development takes place.
Okay, so we were discussing how capitalism became dominant, how it triumphed, how it became the way of the world, basically. For capitalism to triumph, it had to change for humans the idea of what a human is. It had to change to give humans a whole new story, which we call this a meta-narrative. Yani it's a story that explains humanity from its origin through all the stages of humanity's history.
A new theology for this new religion, you mean?
Yes, a new theology. So we already talked about some of the elements of this new theology. Let me talk about two other elements. If you are going to come up with a new story of humanity, you have to, for example, answer a very important question. Where do we come from? So during the Enlightenment, you had the idea of Darwin's theory of evolution was presented as the point. And one thing we should always remember, that when Karl Marx wrote his Das Kapital, in one of the editions, it was dedicated to Charles Darwin, because Karl Marx saw in Charles Darwin the idea of the dialectic, that humanity is this continuous, constant battle, survival of the fittest. So by telling humans that you are like an animal, and your reality is one of war and survival and striving to survive, again, an idea that was also developed by Thomas Hobbes, who talked about the state of nature. When you convince humans that this is what they are, you have already opened up the possibilities for an economic system that looks like capitalism, because now you justify things like materialism. At our core, we are material beings. There is no spirit, there is no soul, there is nothing beyond this wall. And you have introduced the idea of individualism, because each person is to himself or herself, that you have to survive and overcome others to continue, to persevere, to sustain yourself. And you've opened up also the possibility of competition, that because capitalism is based on the idea that life is about competition and not cooperation. So Darwin's theory made it possible for us to develop these other ideas of capitalism. Another line of argument that was used, and this was used mainly by people like Adam Smith and others, the idea that, which we call deism. Deism says that the world was created by a God, but that this God is like a watchmaker. He created a watch, and he put in this watch a mechanism that the world can operate by, and then this God decided to retire.
So it doesn't intervene nowadays.
It doesn't intervene. Again, like the idea of laissez-faire in economics, that the market should be left to operate by itself, and government, ethics, morality, religion should have no say in how markets operate. So this idea came from this idea of deism or naturalism, that the world contains within it all the laws it needs to function, and God doesn't have to intervene on a regular basis. So these are some of the ideas developed over time that made it possible for capitalism to become the dominant system it is today.
Something very interesting here, that all the realities that we live of capitalism, modernity, materialism are all based on theories and philosophers who talked about such stuff.
No. Yes. And this is not, it didn't come from a vacuum. It's slowly developed. And but the clever thing, and this is a point that we need to emphasize over and over again, the clever thing is you always have the ideas presented to us بلباس ديني. There is a religious garment, a religious flavor that's given to these arguments, when if you look at these arguments at their root, they're anti-religious. They're a theology, a neo-pagan theology that takes us back to the ideas of the Romans and the Greeks and the civilizations that came before.
So such philosophers and thinkers who talked about, who led us to this situation of modernity and materialism, they represented and manifested an era of thinking or a society that lives with such values and norms. So they try to go further in it, or yes, they invented such theories, or?
Okay, the good question. Karl Marx used to say that a philosopher has to change the world. يعني a philosopher should not be someone just giving out ideas.
But to a better world, not to a world.
Yes. To them, and Shahid al-Sadr mentions this. He says that some of these intellectuals, some of these philosophers believe that these ideas will bring us a better world. And part of the reason was because some of them were reacting against the oppression and the mistakes of the Roman Catholic Church. So, and the religious wars that were happening in Europe. So some philosophers and thinkers believed that we cannot continue with religion as it is. We have to come up with something new, and only by coming up with something new, different from Christianity, can we live a world of peace and prosperity. So part of the blame is on the errors of religion itself. And of course, there is another side to it, that this is a struggle for power. يعني نحن, we should remember in the Quran, for example, it tells us that every time a prophet was sent to a community, the first group that will fight the prophet were the ruling class, the elite class, the rich class.
The mutrafin, as Quran says.
Right, because these prophets, by trying to reform the society or transform the society they are part of, they were posing a danger to the interests of this class. And this class, to fight the ideas of these prophets, they had to come up with ideas of their own. And some of these ideas were developed by philosophers who are sympathetic to the rich class, or who cater to the interests of the rich class. But that's not to say that all philosophers have a sinister agenda, have an evil agenda against religion. Some really believed that religion was to blame, and we have to acknowledge that many of the reactions to religion were the fault of religion itself. But of course, it was taken to an extreme which doesn't justify the initial crime.
And some philosophers also react to a given view of religion, where
yes,
people
or a given interpretation. Yes, very, very true. Yes.
Here, Dr. Ayman, we'll go to our second part of this very nice discussion, and we'll talk about some of the theories you talked about and you wrote in your book, and in an article which is titled "Being Virtues in Markets." This article, we can call it an Islamic view or an economic society which is based on Islamic spirituality and ethics. You start by mentioning a hadith reports that the Prophet Muhammad once passed by a group of brokers, and he says that they will go to hell because the traders stopped trading and closed their shops. But another hadith states that a good trader shouldn't lack sincerity and charity, honesty, and being selfish, and not being selfish. Moreover, another hadith states that the truthful merchants will stand with martyrdoms on the day of judgment. So how can we understand the Islamic perspective towards trade, business, and businessmen?
Okay. So these two or three hadith that you mentioned, when you read them, to someone who is not very knowledgeable about Islamic economics and what the Prophet feels about markets and trade, we should always remind ourselves that the Prophet himself was a merchant, may get conflicting views. They may look at these hadiths and think there's something contradictory here. But really it's not. And I will explain towards the end of my answer why it's not. But let's answer this in two parts. One is bishakl, let's call this the formative side. The other is bil-madmoon, and let's call this the substantive side. I will start with the latter. Let me start with the substantive part. The substantive aspect deals with the substance of the hadith and what it says about trade and traders. And of course, before we even get to the hadith, we should also remind ourselves that in the Quran, there are several verses that refer to trade and markets. For example, the ayah that says, إِلَّا أَن تَكُونَ تِجَارَةً عَنْ تَرَاضٍ مِنْكُمْ. So in the Quran, it talks about trade and mutual consent. أو رجال لا تلهيهم تجارة عن ذكر الله. The idea that traders and merchants should always exercise remembrance of God at dhikr. And there is a hadith by the Prophet that says, السماح أحد أوجه الربح, that benevolence or compassion is one aspect of profit. So on the substantive side, Islam is very much pro-markets and pro-trade. The Prophet was a merchant. Islam was spread by the word of merchants. When Muslim merchants traveled to distant lands, many of them were preaching the new religion to these new communities. So what these hadith are telling us is that there is a huge responsibility on traders, on merchants. Allah أحل الله البيع وحرم الربا, that bay'a, market transactions, buying and selling, these were all actions that are blessed by Allah. But at the same time that the Quran and the Hadith praise the work of merchants and traders, they also admonish and they send warnings to traders and merchants that their trade, that their market activity, their behavior within markets has to always be exemplified, has to always be based on the attributes of honesty, transparency, being true to your buyer, not being oppressive, not using false advertising, not overpricing, not taking advantage of your buyers. And at the same time, on the buyer's side, that buyers have to feel with the seller, that sometimes not all sellers are predatory, that some sellers sometimes they're in a tight spot and buyers have to feel with them. So this reciprocal relationship between a buyer and seller, عن تراضٍ منكم, is a form of golden rule, which we're going to talk about later in another section. This is the substantive side. In بالمضمون, Islam is for markets, it is for trade, but at the same time highlights and emphasizes the need for traders to be very careful about every act and every behavior and every word they utter when they enter a market. On the formative side, and this is just goes to emphasize how important trade is in Islam, how important markets are in Islam. If we look at some of the ayat in the Quran, for example, يرجون تجارة لن تبور هل أدلكم على تجارة تنجيكم من عذاب أليم إن تقرضوا الله قرضا حسنا. Now, the use of trade and markets in this context is a bit different. Here, the use is metaphorical. And it's not talking about trade, it's talking about our relationship with God, but it's using market terminology, market language to explain this relationship. Now, this, I believe, proves how important trade is and markets are. Because if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is using the example of a market or business or trade to explain the relationship between him and believers, then it must be that trade is a very blessed, it's a very significant relationship. Another hadith by the Prophet, التجارة تسعة أعشار الرزق. Now this can be explained in both ways. Either in a direct way, that trade makes up most of a nation's wealth, which today is true. Most of a nation's wealth today happens through trade. We live in a globalized world. Trade is all about, globalization is all about trade. But it can also be explained metaphorically, the idea that humans respond to reward and punishment. That this reminds me of القول الإمام علي من يعبدك خوفا من نارك فتلك عبادة العبيد ومن يعبدك طمعا في جنتك فتلك عبادة التجار. يعني the Imam is, all of these ways of reaching God is fine. Maratib, there are different levels of worshiping God. Some people only think in terms of reward and punishment. They need an incentive. For some, and the Quran always talks about reward and punishment. Some people, to convince them to believe in God, you have to present them with reward and punishment. Others, they don't need reward and punishment. تلك عبادة الأحرار. سيعبدون الله either way, whether there is neither heaven nor hell. Now. So, in summary, what does this tell us about trade? It tells us that Islam wants us to be model traders. It's as if these ayat are telling us that when you enter a market as a buyer or seller and you're engaging in a market transaction, imagine that who you are engaging with is God. And if who you are trading with is God, then that should put on you a grave responsibility. That should make you be very, very careful about everything you say and everything you do. And this is what the golden rule that we're going to talk about later on really is all about. Rasul says, رحم الله رجلا سمحا إذا باع وإذا اشترى وإذا اقتضى. إذا اقتضى دين, a debt.
So you're talking about the mystical economics, like awliyaullah, the people of God that come
right.
society and they live all these very high virtues inside the society.
Yes. أدلكم على تجارة تنجيكم. So why don't we say that even though God is talking about something that is not business-like, but what he's trying to tell us is that when you enter a business relationship or transaction, I want you to behave in this way. To feel that this person who you are dealing with represents me in a sense. على مبدأ ارحموا من في الأرض يرحمكم من في السماء. The idea that if I am transacting with you and I, as a seller, know that this car that I'm selling you is poor quality, but you as a buyer, you don't know that it's poor quality because this is information only me as the seller has. But then when I'm dealing in this transaction with you, I remember God. And then I remember reward and punishment. I remember heaven and hell. And then I decide to say, no, I am not going to cheat this buyer into buying a car that I know is poor quality, but selling it to him as good quality. So this is what the Prophet is telling us, that if you as a trader, you become كالأولياء الصالحين, then at the day of judgment you will be in the same rank of a martyr, of a shaheed. But if you as a trader decide to put profit above everything else, then you would be the worst kind of a Muslim, because you are causing so much harm in a market, and this harm is multiplied because we all know in a market every transaction gets multiplied across the market.
Great, because you will be with the martyrs in the judgment day, because in this life you acted like martyrs, because you acted without ego and without keeping personal interest as a priority. So when you acted like a martyr, so you deserve an afterward with them.
Yes, exactly, very true.
You mentioned a very nice understanding of this ayah, because normally هل أدلكم على تجارة تنجيكم, people understand that يؤمنون بالله, that the faith and other stuff is what God is talking about. But you mentioned an understanding that such trade, where inside the trade you believe in God, and the belief in God manifestates in your ethical or practical life in trade.
Yes, yes. Yani, when God uses trade to explain one of the most intimate relationship between a believer and his creator, then God is using a model that he must definitely feel very highly of. But it's inverse also, because he wants us to use this model ونسقطها على تعامل في السوق, to apply it to a real market.
Great, great. And here we will talk about one of the main characteristics of an Islamic economy, which is based on virtues and ethics, which is justice. And we see in the Quran that one of the main goals of prophets, that لِيَقُومَ النَّاسُ بِالْقِسْطِ, to apply or implement justice in societies. And obviously justice has many levels, materialistic, spiritual, in the relation with God, in the relation with other people, in the society. So if you'd like to talk about this major characteristic.
Okay. To get to justice, we have to go a few steps back. We must answer a more fundamental question. Before we answer the question, what is justice and how does justice play within a market, we have to go back to the most important question, and that is, what is the purpose of creation? Why did God create humans and place them on this earth? What role or function did God entrust to humanity? And the answer starts with the ayah, إِنَّا عَرَضْنَا الْأَمَانَةَ عَلَى السَّمَوَاتِ وَالْأَرْضَ وَالْجِبَالَ فَأَبَيْنَ أَنْ يَحْمِلْنَهَا وَأَشْفَقْنَا مِنْهَا وَحَمَلَهَا الْإِنسَانُ إِنَّهُ كَانَ ظَلُومًا جَهُولًا. We offered this trust to the heavens and the earth and the mountains, and they refused it. And man decided to take it upon him, to take this trust upon himself. What is this trust? This trust is the idea that نحن خليفة الله, we are God's vicegerents. In Christianity, this is called stewards, the stewardship theory. In Islam, we use a different term sometimes. We call it vicegerency, which simply means Khalifatullah. So what does this order of creation tell us? Yani, what is this meta-narrative that Islam is presenting to us? Islam is presenting a story. The Quran is all about stories. Rusul is all about stories. The Islamic story is as follows. God created the world and placed man as humanity, as Khalifatullah, vicegerents upon this world. Now the question is, what are we entrusted with? We are entrusted with maintaining God's gift. God gave us a gift in this world, His bounties, nature, ourselves. Everything in this world was a gift to us. Our responsibility was to preserve this gift, to manage this gift in the best way possible. So here we start with vicegerency. Vicegerency means a responsibility that we have upon us. يعني أفحسبتم أنما خلقناكم عبثا. The world is not created randomly. It's not something that was created without a purpose, and the purpose was decided after creation happened. There is a purpose. So as humans, the Quran tells us that your purpose is to be responsible for this creation as vicegerents. Now, how are we to be responsible? God did not just give us this world and say, be responsible vicegerents and figure out what to do. No. We are told how to go about being responsible vicegerents. The way we are responsible is where justice comes in. And let me quote a very nice saying by Imam Ali that says, for those who put in order what is between them and God, God will put in order what is between them and other people. And for those who put in order their task for the hereafter, al-akhirah, God puts in order their business in this world. And those who have caution from themselves have protection from God. So there is a taratubiyya, there is a sequence here. We are responsible vicegerents, our trustees. Now this responsibility, there are different levels to it. The first level is we are responsible towards God. Then we are responsible towards ourselves and others. Then we are responsible towards nature and the world that we live in. This responsibility means that you owe something to every one of these dimensions: God, yourself, others, nature. What do you owe them? You owe them to give each one of them what they deserve. Give each one of them what is their due, what is their right. And that precisely is the definition of justice. Imam Ali says, Al-adl an tada'a al-shay' fi makani. And this, Imam al-Sadiq in another saying, they asked Imam al-Sadiq, ما هو العقل? العقل هو الذي يضع الشيء في موضعه أو في مكانه. And then they ask him again, ومن هو الذي غير عاقل أو لا عاقل؟ قال لقد فعلت. يعني I already defined Allah عاقل by defining من هو العاقل. العاقل who puts everything in its proper place, in its right place. Allah عاقل who doesn't put everything in its proper place, in its right place. Now, how do we as responsible vicegerents put everything in its right place? First, we have to give to God what we owe God: piety, iman, gratitude, obedience, submission. All of these mean different. All of these different names mean the same thing. هو الإيمان والتقوى. Now, this iman or taqwa, when it translates to how we behave with others, we behave with ourselves, how we behave with nature, this is where justice comes in. هذا هو العدل. العدل is you being pious, you being a believer, a faithful believer in action, in your acts. Now, how does this show to the world? Yani when you decide to be a just person, and by being a just person, like we said, is someone who gives each person or thing its due, what it's right. How does this manifest itself in real life? It manifests itself in virtues. And so in a market, when we are just, this leads to a market that is virtuous. An economy or society where its members are just towards one another, after being just towards God, this economy or society will slowly become a virtuous economy and a virtuous society. So there is a chain of events here, a chain or a line of sequence. Vicegerency, responsibility, piety, justice, virtue. And anytime you break any part of this formula, the whole formula breaks apart. And this is something we're going to be discussing later on. For example, can you have justice without piety? Can you have justice without vicegerency? Can you have virtue without justice? These are all questions that we may touch upon later on.
For a real life example, we can talk about like in human resources and in jobs, like we appoint certain people or we based on their qualities. This is a kind of justice that we're applying. So
yes. يعني when the Quran tells us يا أيها الذين آمنوا كونوا قوامين بالقسط شهداء لله ولو على أنفسكم. So the whole order of creation, the whole story that Islam is presenting to us is that this world was based on justice. If the world is based on justice, then how can we be responsible vicegerents? We have to be just. And if في حديث للرسول, I think, that says تخلقوا بأخلاق الله. فمن أخلاق الله العدل. And so to be a pious believer That means you have to be a just believer. And the way justice materializes, like you said, in our workplace, in our family, with our neighbors, with our friends, with our relatives, is to be virtuous. And virtue is justice in action, basically. That's how you can think of.
So keeping a right person in his right place is only a very small example of justice, whereas it is a very broad theory.
Yes.
Doctor, when you were talking about such theories and concepts, because we are mentioning Quran, Prophet sayings, Imam Ali sayings, so are we talking about a special kind of economy that only can be implemented in Islamic societies or societies with a majority of Muslim people, or we're talking about general human virtues and ethics which can be implemented all around societies and cultures?
Very good question. First, let me say that the ideas that we have been discussing about virtue and justice and vicegerency and responsibility and piety, that all of these will lead to a virtuous market or virtuous economy. Many of these ideas, most of these ideas, you find parallels for them in other religions, especially Christianity. In Christianity, we also have the idea that God created this world and humans are stewards. And the way humans should behave is by being just to one another. And Christianity talks about virtues. But an important point here is this, that even though to an outsider, to a non-Muslim, these ideas may at first seem to be unique to Islam, they are not unique to Islam. They may be called different names in other religions, even religions that are not monotheistic. Even like Buddhism and Hinduism and Confucianism. Many of these religions share many of these elements. But one thing we realize, and this is an important point, that if the formula I talked about, vicegerency, responsibility, piety, justice, and virtue, it's not enough that we adopt the formula. We have to be specific about what each part really says. And what do we mean by justice? The idea of giving each person or thing what it deserves, this is very important, because if you use a different definition of justice, the whole relationship will fail. What does it mean to be vicegerent? There is an immense responsibility on a believer who is supposed to be God's Khalifa on this earth. This idea, if it's missing from your worldview, you will not have the same view of nature, for example. When we're talking, let's say, about environmental problems, climate change, for example, I don't think there is any idea bigger than you saying man is God's vicegerent on earth. This is the most sublime, the highest position you can put man, and at the same time the highest responsibility you can impose on man towards nature. If this is missing, then you will not have the same care and compassion and interest about preserving nature and resources as you would have in this Islamic worldview. So to answer your question, there are many similarities.
Just to summarize what you said, then you can go further. So you mean here there is 2 points. The first point, that we find many commonalities and similarities between all religions in the world, especially when we were talking about general ethics, morality, virtues, because it's something that all prophets of God and all religions, they emphasize on. And then the second point, we'll talk about the advantages or the value added in such religions or no, and then we are talking about Islam and the very high state of virtue that manifested in Islam as a religion.
Yes. That if this worldview is all interconnected. You cannot say, it doesn't mean that we cannot find a space that's common to all of us. But we have to keep in mind that the parts you leave out of this space are significant as well. And by leaving them out, you may get to a partial virtuous society or economy, but you will not get what the full Islamic vision is trying to present to us.
So Islam offers an updated religious view.
Well, as Muslims, we believe it presents the final and the most complete. And it includes within it all of the virtues and great ideas that came before, but added to them and develop them into a more mature, into a more advanced, into a more complete framework.
Thank you, Doctor. Until here, we reach to the end of our first part of this very nice discussion about economics and virtues and Islamic economics. And be with us in the second part of this interview and discussion, and we'll talk about other important aspects, Imam Ali's view about justice and Islamic economics, and other questions also, Quran and some of the golden rules here in a society that is based on virtues. So be with us, and thank you.